Hey everybody, it's Nathan Crane, founder of the Panacea Community and executive producer of Unify Fest. And I'm really excited you're continuing to join us for the second annual Self-Reliance Summit. You know, this event is really about building skills for a more sustainable world and really about helping each of us to realize how to live more self-reliant and in harmony with this incredible planet and really all of our relatives here. And today I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker, Jason Matthias. Jason is a lifelong gardener, 17-year Air Force veteran and visionary entrepreneur. He's the founder of a family business with his children called Seeds for Generations that provides heirloom garden seeds and inspiration for gardening as a family. Jason's also the co-founder and executive producer of the Beyond Off-Grid Project, a documentary film and media project about reducing your dependence on the modern economy and creating local community interdependence. Hey, Jason, thanks so much for being with us, man.
Thanks for having me, Nathan. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And so I know you've got a pretty epic presentation to share with us today. We're going to be really diving into, what is the grid? How does it affect us? How are we related with it? How do we, live more in harmony? How do we go beyond the grid? How do we go beyond sustainable to the next level? So at this point, I'm just going to hand over the presentation to you. I know you've got some great slides, and I'll let you lead the show from here.
Great. Thanks, Nathan. All right, here we go. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, folks, thanks for coming to this presentation. Appreciate your time and attention. Not unlike the film that I'm producing that will be coming out summer this year. This presentation is going to cover a lot of ground. I'm not going to dive deep into a lot of stuff, and Nathan's asked me to not cover too much intro stuff, but I am going to cover some background so that we can all be on the same page for the why of what decisions we make regarding the future and our vision for the future, our plans for the future, and our families and our communities and our nation. Because if we don't understand the why, we're going to be making poor decisions about the future and ones that are misinformed. So first, a little bit about me. As Nathan said, I'm a husband and a father. We have 7 children. My oldest just turned 12 this week. And we are a lively family, as you can imagine, with a lot of little ones. But we're a gardening family, and that comes from my upbringing. I grew up in Southern California, and where fortunately in that kind of climate, you actually have about a 10-month growing season. So we always had a garden growing since I was a little baby, and I grew up in the garden. I'm doing the same with my kids. And you'll hear me mention later in the presentation, there's a gardening is a recurring theme. I'm also an Air Force veteran, as he mentioned. 11 years active duty, a bunch in the reserves. I spent a lot of time overseas, and I'm proud to have been able to serve my country, and very privileged to have a lot of the opportunities I've had in the past. But I feel as equally privileged to be involved with Beyond Off-Grid Project, which Nathan gave you a little intro about. If you want to learn more about it, you can go to beyondoffgrid.com. Our tagline is return to the old paths, and that is really about trying to reclaim what's been lost, the greatness of America and Western civilization in a lot of ways, which is really has to do with the basing things in the family and the community and doing things on a sustainable basis rather than a basis of dependency and centralization, which is what you'll see as we go through this presentation. So let's get into it. What is the grid? A lot of people think of the grid as the electrical grid, and certainly the electrical grid is a grid. It entraps us in many ways. But the electrical power grid is only one aspect of this larger grid system. And I want to talk about some of the other aspects of it that you may not have thought about before. The food production and control grid is one that if you are into healthy eating, and particularly the local food movement, you probably have come to recognize this particular grid, which is basically seeking to limit your liberty and your freedom of choice and the freedom of what you grow and feed your family. Talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the culture control grid and how modern culture, in some ways more than anything else, ends up controlling people through mass manipulation and groupthink and such. We'll also talk about a financial control grid and an economic control grid. I'll distinguish between those two, but those are very important, particularly because they are going to be one of the biggest determinations in what kind of choices you have available to you and your family. And then obviously the government has a certain control grid and they want to do things, but that's kind of a minor thing in my perspective, but I do want to touch on that as well. So talking about food production and control, we have to understand that America and the West in general, in fact, Europe to a lesser extent than America, but particularly America has gone through this radical agricultural transformation, whereas we used to be a nation of self-sufficient agrarians, largely producing most of what we needed in our households and trading and bartering for those other things that we needed that we didn't produce ourselves, largely on a local basis, sometimes a regional basis. Now we have a over-specialized class of industrial farmers who many of them don't even grow their own garden. So they buy their food at the grocery store and a Walmart just like everybody else does. Just they drive big tractors on hundreds of thousands of acres and produce large monoculture crops for the agribusiness complex. The loss of family farms has occurred in that time through that transition, primarily because particularly after World War II, when agriculture was industrialized, there was this massive bigger is better type of approach to farming, and that required debt. And so the debt often would get ahead of the ability of the farmers to repay. And because particularly, farmers can't control weather, having a bad weather year often meant the inability to pay off debts and therefore defaulting on the debts and the loss of assets, including land and the farm itself. And so believe it or not, family farms in America decreased from 7 million in 1900 to less than 2 million at the end of the century. So we had this massive reduction in the number of family farms. Most of those people moved to the city to get jobs, or in other ways were amalgamated into the corporate modern economy. But we have to understand that the transformation in America largely has followed the transformation of from being a self-reliant, industrious, largely agrarian people to moving away from the means of production on the farm and in the country and moving towards the cities where we're dependent on the corporate economy. That's very important to understand as the basis for where we find ourselves today.
Jason, really quick, I have a question. In your research, have you found at all during that time, during that transition phase, that there was propaganda happening, advertising, commercials, etc., that were pushing people away from family farming, from creating their own things and buying the new manufactured things that were better and bright, like Wonder Bread, right? There was all the advertising and commercials about Wonder Bread, even though it was this really terrible manufactured stuff that was filled with junk. It was like, trying to get people away from making their own bread to buying this new Wonder Bread. And I remember seeing some commercials that was like very much like propaganda. Have you seen a lot of that at that time too, that could have been majorly influential in pulling people away from family farms?
Yes, that is, we actually cover that for at least a few minutes in some depth in the film. But briefly, you saw what you were describing happen tremendously in the 1950s, right? Because what happened in the 50s? The men came back from World War II. The women had been ushered into the workforce during that time. The baby boom happened, and because of the industrial manufacturing capacity, there was this ability to produce all these new appliances and gadgets and all these things that were supposedly work-saving devices, right? Well, the problem is that as those work-saving devices are implemented, in particular, and this is really an extension of what had been happening for 50 years or more, really since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but as you reduce the need for labor through these time-saving devices, what do you reduce the need for? Children. You actually reduce the importance of family becomes less because you have machines that can do things for you. So rather than the family working together to do all the household chores and take care of animals and bake the bread and harvest the crops and all these kind of things, it was pretty significant. And that coupled with women going into the workforce and changing their focus from home-centered to being more outward-centered and going into the corporate workforce, especially that advanced more in the 70s and 80s. But Um, the propaganda that was done through marketing of convincing people that they needed these things when they really didn't need these things, right? Because they never existed before, and they got along just fine without them. That marketing and propaganda, I think, is a good word. Got people thinking that, oh, they need these things, and that whole term "keeping up with the Joneses," right? That really came along with the massively growing economy in the 50s, and all, more disposable income, and all these devices and appliances and things that people never had before, but all of a sudden all their friends were getting them, and they wanted to kind of keep up with all the cool things that other people have, and not look like they were, poor, or what, you still have to grind your own wheat, or you still bake your own bread, versus, like you were saying, buying manufactured bread in the store. It happened even earlier than that, though, really, even through print advertising in the early part of the 1900s and even late 1800s. That same kind of convincing people that they needed these manufactured goods to replace labor. And the problem with it is some of those things are actually time-saving devices, but in a lot of cases, what it ended up doing was it's kind of a trick, right? So the good example, and Franklin Sanders, who we interviewed for our film, talks about this. 1917 was the most critical year in the transformation of agriculture, because it was the starting point when the Fordson tractor was introduced. And what did the tractor do? It took, it basically replaced draft animals as the motive power on the farm. So whereas before, farmers would have animals, and you still see this in Amish communities, they'll have draft animals, and they raise a certain amount of their acreage for feed, either in pasture and hay, or sometimes in grain, to feed and therefore fuel that motive power of animals. But once a tractor comes along, they can no longer grow their own fuel, right? They have to buy it. They have to buy gasoline and lubricants and all this stuff from the petroleum industry. So they become dependent upon that petroleum industry. And rather than having a self-replicating workforce of draft animals, which again have babies, the tractor just depreciates in value and breaks down and needs to be repaired all the time. So it wasn't that they were just, yeah, you could get a lot more done with the tractor, but the problem is that you then made yourself dependent upon the tractor suppliers and the petroleum industry and all these other things. So that's just one example of how, even with something that you're analyzing from a business perspective of, this tool is going to increase my productivity and my ability to produce product, it still in some ways is a trap, because you're making yourself dependent upon the supplier of whatever you need to make that tool set work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was really the beginning of our, loss of self-reliance and interdependence within families and small communities. So, yeah, no, thank you. I mean, it was great clarity on that.
Getting back to kind of where we're at today in the how does the agriculture relate to where most people are at? Because most people have no connection to agriculture anymore. Largely, it is through the means of processed food, right? So processed food spending has doubled in the last 30 years. And this is an overhead view of a supermarket, and you notice that there is all these crazy bright colors, right, of all the packaging. And this goes back to the marketing and propaganda you were talking about earlier. Very few people, except those who have made a determination to eat healthy, have the wherewithal to avoid the processed food that is the result of this industrialized food system. And why do we have all these processed food products? And why is this food, quote unquote food, so cheap? Like, food is really cheap in America. It's like, of all the countries in the world, we have like the lowest amount of our budgets that go towards food. One of the reasons for that is government intervention in the economy, particularly through ag subsidies. So when the government subsidized corn and soy, particularly because those are the two main food inputs to all this processed food products, they can then provide cheap inputs. The output of those crops are cheap inputs for food producers. So the food producers lobby the government for these subsidies, which supposedly go to farmers, but really what they are is, it's kind of a end around subsidy for the food industry, and also for John Deere and all the tractor manufacturers and stuff, because they're the ones that are benefiting from an industrial monocrop type of agriculture. The way that it ends up coming back to the people, other than the fact that our taxes are going to subsidize these things, is we get quote unquote cheap food, but it's not really food, right? It's processed, denatured, devoid of largely of any nutrients, food product that is making us sick. And that, largely you look at food spending, processed food spending doubling over 30 years. That's about the same period of time where we've had this massive growth in all these health epidemics, diabetes, heart disease, food allergies in particular are becoming a big one in the past decade. Those are all related to this transformation of agriculture to bigger is better, government intervention in that market, largely on behalf of corporations, and the people have suffered for it. The one other note I'll make is that one other benefit or beneficiary of this ag subsidies in the end kind of way is the healthcare industry and the pharmaceutical industry, because when people get sick with chronic disease because of the food they're eating, they go to the doctor, and what's the doctor give them? The doctor gives them a bunch of drugs to treat their symptoms. So I don't have a healthcare grid in this presentation, but there is a healthcare grid, and I think a lot of people, especially with the Affordable Care Act, so to speak, and the implications of that being implemented, and people seeing, hey, this is just a racket, right? It's just a way for insurance company to force people to buy their product and have less service. That is a grid in and of itself, but it's tied to this food production and control grid, because they control us through the food and they make us weak through the food, which then makes it more difficult for us to be self-reliant, to work towards changing the system, because people are just apathetic because they're chronically ill. And that's something I think a lot of people need to understand in the big picture. If you're frustrated about these things, the first thing you have to do is change your lifestyle, and then encourage others that to also change their lifestyle, so that by reducing the demand for those products, we therefore change the market. And a good example of that is the non-GMO verified label, right? That's not a government mandated labeling or anything else. The market came up with that because the consumers wanted to know if there was GMO in their food or not. And so the market answered with a private voluntary system that is on thousands and thousands of products now that you see in the grocery store and health food stores.
I do want to just say that in a different way for folks listening, because I think that's probably one of the most important points that we can realize in empowering ourselves to truly make change in our communities is, voting with our dollars. I mean, the GMO movement was born out of, and I've been a part of that since kind of, early on, and an integral part of it, part of that movement, educating people about GMOs and organic food. And I mean, almost a decade now I've been a part of it. And, it was born out of a movement of people who wanted healthier food, who didn't want science dictating, modifying the genes that nature has already perfected simply for profits. And, as people got together and raised awareness, the thing that's really made, like Cheerios coming out with non-GMO, and a lot of these big, huge brands that have used GMO corn syrup and stuff, and Chipotle and many other big fast food restaurants, and they're saying, look, okay, the market doesn't want GMOs, so we'll come out with a new product that has no GMOs. That's simply because people like you and I go to the grocery store, we go to our farmers market, we go to the co-op, and we buy organic. We buy non-GMO. We specifically look for those things that are non-GMO verified and or organic. And the next level of that, obviously, is we're growing our own food. So whatever we're not growing, we are buying. We're making sure, for sure, it's not GMO. Our dollar is voting and telling the industry what we want. It's saying, look, we don't want GMOs. And they listen. If they have one bad quarter, people get fired in these corporations. And they look at changing, everything. If they have two bad quarters, it's like they're revamping everything. I mean, for them, it's all about profits in a lot of cases. So, vote with your dollar. It really makes such a huge impact.
Yeah, and that's just a corollary of, if you want to see change in the world, institute the change in yourself first. So this is something that I think most people that kind of become interested in self-reliance come to realize. But because most of us have not grown up in a self-reliant lifestyle and background in this, anybody that's alive now, right, past 100 years, um, it's only our grandparents that have probably any tie back to that kind of a lifestyle. There's all of these things that are normal, quote unquote, in modern life that are abnormal historically, which we don't necessarily realize. And so they're very insidious. We really have to rethink everything in order to truly gain freedom, because we have to question very basic assumptions that everybody else would never question. All right, let's move on here real quick. So we have this very centralized agriculture system, and it's not just centralized in terms of very big farms, big agribusiness corporations involved in the process, but you've got geographically centralized production, particularly in California, right? California Central Valley produces unbelievable amounts of food, hugely productive with the industrial crop production system that's in place and what modern technology makes available. The problem is that California is naturally a desert, and the irrigation that is used in the Central Valley comes from snow melt off of the mountains. Generally, that is kept in reservoirs, but the reservoirs the past couple of years have been looking like this one, where they're basically empty. And so a couple of years ago, California State Water Board had to cut off irrigation water supplies to entire counties in the Central Valley. This is what the drought monitor map for the U.S. looks like as of the beginning of this year, and you'll see that the entire central part of California is in the most, it's exceptional. It's the highest level of drought, and it's actually been that way for 3 years straight. And pretty much almost the entire state of California is in a significant drought. The importance of this is that at least for fresh fruits and vegetables, generally speaking, about 70% or more of most of the fresh fruits and vegetables that are grown in the United States are grown in that area that is dark red on that map. Okay, so we've put all of our proverbial eggs in one basket, so to speak, with California growing most of the produce. And the problem is that it does that very well in terms of efficiency, but then when you have a drought, what do? Right? Farmers are having to pump groundwater out, and they're pumping out so fast out of the aquifer into the Central Valley that in some places the ground's actually sinking by a foot a year. And so that's not sustainable, obviously. So we run a significant risk of, in the very near future, unless California's rainfall situation turns around and they come out of drought, that you could look at even more significant reductions in crop production there than we have already seen. And if you've been watching food prices, particularly fresh fruits and vegetables, you've noticed in the past year or two that they've gone up quite significantly, as much as 20, 30, 40% in many cases. So the reason I mention all this is because we have to understand it's not just a problem of corporatizing and big agribusiness, but it's also this kind of foolishness of geographically centralizing all our production in one place, where we don't have the resilience that we should have in our food systems, which up until the modern era of industrial food was all food was local, right? It was all produced locally and shipped. If it was shipped anywhere, it wasn't shipped more than probably a day's journey. So beyond the production system, you've got the distribution system, which is a modern, petroleum-based, just-in-time supply chain. There's not really supplies at the end point. They used to be in the grocery store. You'd have a stock room in the back. Those don't exist anymore. It's just a transit point in the back from where the truck delivers the stuff and it gets put on the shelves. So most grocery stores only have a 3-day supply on hand. And what this does is, and that's at normal consumption rate. So what it does is it makes the system very vulnerable to shocks in either supply or demand. So if supply gets cut off because of transportation issues, or there's a huge demand surge because of something like a hurricane or a winter storm, you get empty shelves like this. Now, the problem with this is that this is not the extent of the problem, right? It's not just that there's only a 3-day supply on the shelves in the stores. It's that there's probably only a 3-day supply on average in most Americans' homes. They don't have a pantry like they used to. They have just what they need, and they go to the grocery store a couple times a week and get what they need just in time. So for any kind of major emergency or any kind of disruptions, whatever they might be, there's very little resilience in the system. And the problem with this is that, of course, if people are hungry, they will do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. And so you have the prospect for breakdown in societal fabric, it's a social unrest, rioting, all these kind of things. And in America, you know, if cities riot when their sports teams win, what do we have to look forward to when there's no food in the stores and people are hungry, literally hungry? It does not bode well for the potential consequences. So these are just some of the reasons why people need to be looking at becoming more self-reliant and relocalizing their food supplies so they're not reliant upon these very centralized, just-in-time systems to supply one of the key essentials of life. I'll pause there for a moment, Nathan, to see if you have any comments or questions before we move on to the next section.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Cool. All right,
yeah.
so I took a little longer than I wanted to on that, but let's move on here. One area that, as I mentioned before, that's a lot of people don't think about is the culture control grid. Going back to what we were discussing earlier, Nathan, you were talking about propaganda and advertising. You know, the most massively influential technology for shaping of opinions and behaviors in the history of mankind is the television. And we've moved beyond the television in a lot of ways. And in some ways, we're better off with the advent of the internet. But you have to think about one of the reasons why we got to the basic foundation that we have today that came about from not just the Industrial Revolution, but also from the post-war boom in the 50s of manufacturing and consumer goods and consumerism, is that people were able to have their minds formed and their thinking patterns shaped by television, which was the medium of the day. That's how they got all their information. I mean, radio was still there too, but you know, the visual element of television was huge. And so you extend this out beyond television. Of course, you know, television kind of conditions people towards seeking entertainment. And so then all other forms of entertainment also get prioritized. Things like, you know, amusement parks and vacations, and sports itself is one of the biggest forms of entertainment, one of the biggest entertainment industries in the country, and just popular culture in general. It's important to understand the purpose that these serve. Right? Yes, they entertain people, and they're meeting a demand in the marketplace. However, you have to understand that the demand is not based upon a need; it is based upon a want or a desire, largely which has been shaped by propaganda and popular culture. Most popular culture activities, entertainment, and particularly sports, the main purpose that they serve in the day in which we live is really to distract people from caring about things that actually impact them and their lives in the future for their families. And so I think in particular sports is one that men need to be very aware of and need to make conscious decisions to avoid. Not that all sports are bad, but to understand that it has its place, and it's very easy to get caught up in sports culture as something that's consuming, but which doesn't really have a positive impact on your life. In most cases, it's wasting time and money and energy that could be productively put to use on other things that are actually going to make a lasting impact in the lives of our families and our communities and the future. So these are things that we need to be aware of. We need to be making changes in our lives to address. And the last thing I'll make on this point is that the recent advent of digital technology, digital entertainment, and particularly mobile devices. If you go around in a major city today, you'll find people walking around like they used to, but you're not going to see them like looking ahead and looking around, right? They're all going to be looking down at their hand, usually, because they're looking at their mobile phone, checking their email, texting, you know, watching TV or something, nearly getting run over by a car as they try to cross the street. It's important to understand that this is a fundamental change in the way, just in the physical way that we interact with each other, and particularly with the youth today who are being raised with these devices available. It changes their entire perception of reality, right? Because they less and less are having to actually interact with people eye contact, listening, reading, nonverbal gestures, and actually having a real conversation with someone, to their primary mode of conversation is through a device. That it really starts to break down true relationships and particularly local community strength, because people are not getting out in their communities and interacting with each other in reality as much. They're tending to do it a lot more online and through these devices. So I see technology as a tool. There's not a whole lot of technology that only has one purpose, which is evil. Most technology can be used for good or evil, and therefore it's up to the user of that tool to make wise decisions about how it's used and how it's employed to get the greatest benefit out of it for themselves and for those around them, and to be responsible with it. So it's an important point that I think that needs to be made, is that we need to be thinking about these things consciously and not just kind of going with the flow, because it's very easy to get sucked into digital devices, digital entertainment, Facebook, all these kind of things, and really waste a lot of time and energy and not paying attention to things that are important in life, like relationships with our families and our friends and our people in our community. It's important to understand that we have a financial control grid that is impacting every one of us every single day. At the basis of this, it's important to understand that the US dollar is not really a dollar. Sure, it says dollar on there, but the dollars that we have in currency today are not actually dollars as are defined by the U.S. Constitution, which says that they have to be redeemable in silver and gold. They are, if you pull out a bill in your wallet, you do it right now, you'll see what it says on there. It says Federal Reserve note. Well, what is a Federal Reserve note? Federal Reserve note is a debt note. It's an issuance of debt. So what that means is that rather than the U.S. Treasury printing a dollar, an actual dollar, which used to say silver certificate across the top, again, because it could be redeemable in silver, and then issuing it into the economy, what it does now is the Treasury prints bills and gives it to the Federal Reserve, who loans it into circulation, which means that there's always more money owed to the banks through the Federal Reserve System than is actually in circulation. It's kind of hard to think about, but what this does is it creates a gigantic vacuum that's constantly sucking wealth to the banks through the currency itself. Okay, and this is even before you're talking about the Federal Reserve increasing the money supply by printing lots of extra money or adding digits onto what they say they have in the money supply and devaluing the currency, right? This is just the fact that if you have $1 billion in circulation, that $1 billion is not just $1 billion that's in the money supply, but there's $1 billion plus interest that's owed on it because it's owed back to the banks in the Federal Reserve System. Now, on top of that, you have the debasement of the dollar. And since 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created by act of Congress, we've had a staggering debasement of the currency. You see this in other civilizations that met their ruin, like the Roman Empire actually debased its currency significantly, leading up to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in particular. For over 100 years now, the Federal Reserve has been devaluing the US dollar. And these figures are actually a little old, because since 1913, I think we're now at like 98% devaluation from what a dollar was worth in 1913. And just since the year 2000, it's almost 30% value has been lost, which means that if you put $1,000 in the bank in the year 2000, that you would only have, what, 700 and something dollars left. The rest of it, essentially the value was evaporated because the money supply increased and the value of the dollar was decreased. So this is important to note that the money itself, anything you put into savings, is going to be eroded. And usually the rate of inflation is higher than what the government reports it as. And because now, in particular, we have very low interest rates, putting your money in the bank is going to, largely speaking, in real terms, be decreasing the amount of money you have. So this is a challenge because we have to think about wealth and money differently in order to try to fight against this inflationary effect of the dollar being eroded in its purchasing power. The other thing that is very important to understand that happened significantly in the past 20 years or so is what many financial experts refer to as the financialization of the economy. What that means is more and more of the economic activity is happening in the financial sector, like on Wall Street and through the banking system, than is in the actual physical economy. This is kind of a big chart, but I use it because what it does is it shows the spread between the real economy, which is the blue line, the measure of gross domestic product, and the stock market index. And you'll notice that in the middle there where there's that circle, that's the 1929 stock market crash. The stock market got it basically got out of whack with the real economy. So it grew a lot more than the economy, and then it returned back to a more sustainable level. Well, you'll notice on the right side of the chart, since the 80s really, but particularly the 90s and 2000s, we have gone to this extreme spread between what the financial sector is doing and what the real economy is doing, and it stayed there. Even after the 2008 crash, because the Federal Reserve basically pumped a bunch of liquidity into the system, they kept it going, but that's not sustainable. And what we're seeing now this year is the early stages of an unwinding of that entire system. And so we're very likely this year to be seeing something similar to the 2008 crash, except it's not certain whether the powers that be are going to be able to stop the repercussions of their scheme like they were in 2008. So it's important to be watching what's going on in the markets and trying to reduce your exposure to the markets and to those things as much as possible. And what that means is getting your wealth into real assets, things that will maintain their value regardless of what the stock market does, regardless of what inflation does. And that may be precious metals, that might be productive farmland, it might be a lot of different things, but it's certainly not going to be paper assets in Wall Street.
Jason, just briefly, you mentioned that beginning of this year, we're beginning to notice some of those indicators. What are some of the indicators that you've been noticing that is showing, this, some potential crash potential for this year?
Right. Well, I wish I had some charts to show this, but I haven't kind of gathered all that. This is kind of another. It's kind of like an update brief, kind of to this presentation. But the big things that you see is, for one, and this is I need to find. I haven't been able to find an updated chart like this. This one only goes to about 2011. But if you were to get an updated chart on this, what you will notice is the blue line, which is real gross domestic product, which means it's adjusted for inflation. That line is not only leveled off, but now it is actually negative. It's actually going down. So at the same time the stock market is at all-time highs, you have the real economy struggling to grow at all and is actually contracting if you use real economic numbers, not the ones that the government tweaks and government statistics. And I'll get into that a little bit later with talking about unemployment. But you have to realize is that we've been on this unsustainable path for a long time, and particularly with very low interest rates, right? It's what caused the housing bubble and the crash in the housing market, was basically 20 years of low interest rates. We actually have the lowest interest rates. We've been at 0% interest for a number of years, which is unprecedented. The only reason that the dollar is able to not erode in value and have essentially a dollar crisis is that all the other nations of the earth are doing the exact same thing that we are. So it's like a competition. It's a race for the bottom. Who can devalue their currency the fastest? So the euro is doing worse than the dollar is, which is one of the only reasons that the dollar has had any strength in the midst of this craziness that is basically inflating its value away to nothing eventually, right? It's because everybody else, the dollar, the yen, all the other currencies largely are also following the same basic prescription, which is devaluing the currency, monetizing debt for their governments to be spending beyond what they're able to take in. And the big picture is that what this does is anytime that you have government spending money, especially money that it doesn't have, it tweaks and throws out of whack the normal market forces, which help to provide an efficient allocation of capital to where it is going to be used the best. And that's required for the economy to grow. When the government gets involved and starts spending a bunch of money, and then in this case, basically all that we've had the past 8 years is the Federal Reserve pushing a bunch of money to the banks, which then just goes right into the stock market, and largely speaking, it doesn't go into the real economy. That's the reason that so many people are still suffering in the real world, but the bankers are doing great, and the corporate presidents and corporate executives are all doing great. And there's this spread between the ultra wealthy and the upper middle class down to everybody else, is because uh, those the really high income earners are the closest to where all of this money that's being created out of thin air by the Federal Reserve is being pushed out into the system. It's very interesting, actually. I don't have the quote memorized, but there's a quote by Thomas Jefferson that basically talks about how because the discussion of central bank has been going on since the colonial era. It was one of the big things that most of the founding fathers were adamantly against, was a central bank. Thomas Jefferson talks about basically that the banks are going to basically pull all the wealth to themselves, and it will only, the wealth is going to be centralized, and that it only basically reaches the bankers, and then the ones that are closest to the bankers, like the corporate interests. And it's prophetic, because it's exactly what we're seeing today, is that this financialization of the economy is pulling all the wealth to the very wealthy banking and corporate interests, and pulling it away from the rest of the population. To answer your question a little more directly, one other thing that you'll notice is the stock market may be at all-time highs, but that is a kind of an artificial index, right? I mean, what is it measured against? It's measured against the dollar, which is being eroded in value. So how can you actually tell what the value of stocks is? Well, the answer is you can't really, because there's no objective standard. There is an objective standard, however, that you can measure against, something that doesn't change its value in any significant way over time, and that would be precious metals. So if you look at the measure of the stock market versus gold, or the stock market versus silver, what you'll see is that the stock market versus gold versus silver is now heading downward. And so what that means is that even though nominally in the actual number, it's 18,000 or whatever on the stock market, nominally it's at near all-time highs. In the actual terms of how you can actually value something by an objective standard, which would be gold and silver, it's actually on the decline. And the bankers and financial institutions can do a lot of different things to try to rig the system, but ultimately the bottom line is that the real economy is suffering. It's only the financial economy and at the highest levels of the corporate economy that's doing well. And people need to understand that waiting around for things to get better is not a good course of action. We need to take steps to become more self-reliant, less dependent on the centralized economic system and financial system going forward, because what we're in for is, largely speaking, going to be another decade or two of what we've had the past 8 years, since 2008, and it might be significantly worse as well. I'm going to get through this last section here pretty quick, because I want to get on to what can we do about this stuff. The economic control grid is an extension of the financial control grid, a little bit different though, because this has more interaction with what we actually do. The consumerist culture we talked about earlier leads to perpetual indebtedness, because it's normal in our culture to buy things with debt, not just houses and not just cars, but everything, right? Consumer debt. And that is a problem, because everybody can't just spend on debt forever. It's unsustainable. Eventually you have to pay the bills. And we're getting to the point where the people are having to spend money on debt, not just for discretionary items, but even for non-discretionary items, because the economy is so bad. It's also important to realize that the modern economy is a wages and goods economy, right? It requires employment for you to be able to buy the essentials of life and living. Because people are not producing their own food and don't have a source of water, and they, don't, in many cases, don't own their own home, they have payments they have to make. They have to make house payments, they have to make electricity payments, they have to make fuel payments, they have to buy food. All these essential things that are the basic things that need for living require a job. The big problem with this is not just that in and of itself it's a form of slavery to that system, but when you have really rough economic times and unemployment is really high, now you have a lot of people that don't have wages coming in to provide those goods. And so a lot of people are becoming destitute, or they're having to go back to living with family and these kind of things, which has its own benefits in a way. But largely speaking, we're becoming more dependent, not less dependent, because of the way and direction that the economy is going. One of the big things that's happened over the past 30 years is an offshoring of manufacturing and productive enterprise. Jobs moving to China, jobs moving to Mexico, jobs moving anywhere but the US. And what it's resulted in is cities like Detroit, that used to be the crown jewel of industrial America, becoming looking like this. They basically look like a third world war-torn nation. Detroit at one time had well over 1 million people. Now it's down to under, I think, 700,000. And a lot of the city, looks like this. You have industrial factories that are just totally abandoned, entire neighborhoods that are completely abandoned because there's no jobs there. Therefore, there's no way people can support themselves with this wages and goods economy. This is a picture of what major urban areas in America are going to look like over the next 20, 30, 50 years. Right? Detroit was just ahead of its time because it happened to be auto manufacturing primarily, and that all got offshored and outsourced. And so it happened very rapidly there. But you're going to be seeing this happen in a lot more urban centers, particularly in ones where the state government has high tax and spend policies, because it tends to drive business out. And so the Northeast, the West Coast, particularly California, California's a little unique just because Silicon Valley's there and a lot of shipping and stuff. But nonetheless, the inhospitable business climate is going to be driving more and more businesses out unless policymakers make changes that allow for those businesses to stay. But ultimately, what we need to be happening is, instead of having these massive centralized corporations that provide for all the needs of the employment in the community, we need to return to small business and local interdependence. And what we'll see is that the less that we depend on that corporate economy, the more we're going to be able to have more influence on the direction going forward. The impact of a lot of this, kind of deindustrialization and financialization of the economy is that you have household income that's shrinking, and anybody who is not got a six-figure paying job or above probably realizes this. But since 2000, although nominally there's been a 28% increase in median household income, if you adjust it for inflation, it's actually a negative 7%. So a 7% decline in income. This is not because the actual wages declined. People may have actually gotten raises during this time. It is because inflation has eaten away at that purchasing power again, and has made the actual power of that income in purchasing things in the economy even less. And so this is the basic problem that we have with inflation. And this is even aside from losing your job, right? If you have a job, be thankful. It is leading you in a negative direction. So we have to understand that the way things are going are negative. Waiting around for things to get better is not gonna help us. We need to make hard decisions about what we do to change the direction for ourselves. Last little chart here I want to show you is unemployment. So the government says, unemployment is at it's like 5-point-something% or something, right? So the red line here is the government reported number. It's called U3. Before Clinton was in office, they used to report the U6 number. So when Clinton came into office, they changed the number they report, and they basically counted out a bunch of other factors to make the unemployment rate go down. Voila, unemployment went down. Okay. So even if you use the old number, the U6 number, unemployment is still near 10% right now. But that number even discounts a bunch of other factors that you really should be taken into consideration. And so the blue line here is one developed by John Williams, who's an economist who deals with these economic statistics. And he basically counts a lot of those other factors back in. And according to his statistical model, unemployment punched through the 20% mark in 2009, has never looked back. In fact, it's been at 22 to 23% steady since 2010. So for over 5 years, we've had low 20% unemployment in America. You have to realize that this is significant because when we look at history, The only other time we've had over 20% unemployment was during the Great Depression, and that was in 1931. It went up to about 25% and stayed there for about a year, and then it came back down. So in some ways, the job situation in America today is worse than in the worst part of the Great Depression because it's not coming down. It's just staying there. And the government numbers being reported that people are, the unemployment rate's coming down. What that is people using up all their unemployment benefits. They're not counted anymore. People stop looking for jobs because there are no jobs available, and so they're not counted anymore. And so it literally is just entirely propaganda, the way that they count the numbers for statistics to get people to think that it's not that bad. But most people that are middle class or in that range and have relationships in their community and stuff know that there's lots of people suffering out there. They just don't see these actual numbers to know that things are bad. So we see the downward trend in the government numbers. What we see in the actual best numbers that we have, according to John Williams, is a either level or slightly increasing unemployment rate. And that is a warning sign, right? Things aren't getting better, they're getting worse. So what causes that disparity? Well, it's government lies, right? The government is lying about what's happening in order to make people feel better about it and not demand that they stop doing what they're doing to make the situation worse. A better measure would be employment. If you look on the flip side, instead of unemployment, if you look at the population, of the ratio of people that are employed versus the population, what we've seen is since the year 2000, a steady decrease. And we're actually at the lowest level since the 1980 recession in terms of the population, employment to population ratio. And so by objective standards, things are getting worse. And one of the reasons that it's getting worse, particularly for young people, is that a lot of older workers who had planned to retire can't retire. They don't have enough assets to live off of, so they had to keep working. So as they stay in the workforce, you have younger people who can't get into the workforce because there's no jobs available. And so this gives a basic, this chart basically just shows the gray level is the older workers is actually increased in terms of the numbers. And this is since the beginning of 2009. The numbers for young people is getting worse and worse, and they can't get a job. There's some estimates that unemployment among recent college graduates in their 20s is over 50%. Now, in other nations, that would lead to like marches on the streets, right, and rioting and that kind of thing. But in America, it doesn't. Why? Because these young people are playing video games in their parents' basements, and they're consumed with sports and stuff, and they are surviving just fine because everything's being provided for them. They don't need to be self-reliant because they're dependent and they're happy with it. So you have to understand the implications of a dependent lifestyle and a dependent culture go far beyond the negative aspects of that situation. It's actually that it can't correct itself because the normal correction factors like youth marching in the streets to demand better jobs doesn't happen because they don't care about it. They've become that apathetic and or that disenfranchised, that disillusioned that they're not organizing to do that. And I think to the extent you do see that happening, it's with like a lot of the support for like Bernie Sanders and such in the presidential election cycle, where a lot of youth are frustrated with that situation, and his appeals have some power with that group. But overall, nothing's going to change because there's no major movement to change those kind of things. Wrapping this up, it's important to understand that about almost half of Americans receive some form of government payments. This is either welfare, income from the government because they're a state, federal, or local government employee, or even people in the military. And historically, in world history, any time that a civilization has had half or more of the population dependent upon the government, that civilization has not been able to recover. Let me say that again. Historically speaking, there's been no civilization in the history of the world that has recovered from a situation where half of the people were dependent upon the government. Why is this? It's because when the government becomes that large and that so many people become that dependent upon it, there are negative incentives to change the system to prevent it from collapsing on itself. So what we need to do is cut the size of government so that we can get more of the productive capital into work in the actual economy where it can actually grow the economy. But to do that, you have to cut all these benefits and cut jobs for people that are dependent upon those government positions. which is not likely to happen, especially because a lot of them have government employee unions and such. So this is a big warning flag, and this is very similar in a lot of other Western nations, that the situation we have is not sustainable, and it is not likely to get better because there are institutional driving forces that make it very difficult to change. Okay. Almost 50 million Americans are on food stamps. So what you have is this government dependency growing, especially after 2008 financial crisis, as people became, lost jobs and needed assistance for food. It's stayed at that level since about 2011. So what we have from all these things is a recipe for disaster, because you have older workers that can't retire, younger workers that can get a job, unemployment keeps climbing without end, and families can't make ends meet, because even if they have a job, prices are constantly increasing. It's pinching their budgets, and government dependency grows. So why does all this matter? Why am I talking about all these statistics and figures and all these kind of things? It's important to understand that economics are important because it affects every single one of us. We all live in the world of economics every single day. It's important to understand where we're at, because most people that are alive today, whether they realize it or not, have been trained to understand that recessions are short, followed by a recovery. Okay, and this chart actually shows all of the post-World War II recessions. On the left, all those little squiggly dotted X lines and stuff, all the colored lines on the left are all of the post-World War II recessions and their duration in years. So almost all of them were 2 years or less. The black line is the 2001 recession, which took 4 years, and the red line at the bottom not only is the lowest line, but it's also the one that's strung out the longest. And this one actually, it's not even on. This was as of a few years ago. So basically, what we have is the longest post-World War II recession that has not returned to normal. So what we have is essentially a depression. We have a as far as employment goes, it is the worst since the Great Depression by far, and in some ways, as I mentioned earlier, even worse. It's important to understand this because you need to understand we're in a different circumstance now than we have been in all of the time period that we have lived our lives. There's very few people that went through the Great Depression that are still alive. We have to understand that waiting around for things to get better is not going to change things. We're looking at, really realistically speaking, another decade or two, or maybe 3, of more of the same, of just stagnating inflationary conditions that make it very difficult for people to make ends meet. So the only way that you're going to improve that situation is by changing your lifestyle. The indications that I've pointed to really point to a dollar crisis ahead. And as I mentioned earlier, to answer your question, Nathan, the only reason that we don't already have a dollar crisis is because the rest of the world is in a race with us to devalue their currency. So it's a relative thing as far as the currency exchange rates go. So I want to get quickly here. What can we do? What can we do? The first thing you need to do is evaluate your situation. There are some core principles when you do this. The first thing you need to do is identify your areas of dependence, because if you don't work to reduce your dependence, even though you increase your self-reliance in other areas, the dependency is still going to come back to restrict your choices in the future, or even potentially bite you in the butt by critically disabling you to do certain things you might need to do in the future. This goes to the core of what Nathan's talking about. The entire Self-Reliance Summit's about. Identify skills and resources you need to gain, right? So we want to gain skills and resources we can put to use. The first thing you need to do when you're trying to figure out what you need to do in terms of skill acquisition is figure out what things you have and then what things you need to gain going forward, so then you can then proactively go out and acquire those things. You want to identify and connect to your local community. This is crucial, because as much as the internet is great for enabling things like this where you can learn from people at a distance, when the rubber meets the road, if there's any kind of disruptions in the internet, the electrical grid, the transportation system, the social fabric, any of those things, everything's going to relocalize out of necessity. So you want to have those connections to your local community, and particularly as you're evaluating your situation, you want to understand who has what skills in your community and how are yours complementary with theirs, and what as a whole, like who needs to get what skills to be able to enable you to have the strongest, not just household, but local community that you can have. You want to identify how you can be a more productive household. This goes back to what we were talking about before about trying to not be dependent on lots of technological gadgets that are prone to breaking and that we can't repair, and learn to live more simply and to be more productive and not just be consumers. And finally, you want to make an action plan and start working on it, right? And that hopefully you're already doing that, and that's the reason why you're watching this presentation. So when we're talking about reducing dependency, what are the ways that we need to look at? We need to look at reducing and eliminating debt as quickly as possible. Reducing and eliminating government payments, and this would include, if you're a government employee, looking for non-government employment. Government employment has a lot of benefits. Pensions is one of the big things that often comes with a government job. You have to realize, though, in the future, even though the government may not default on the pensions, they may still pay them out. They're going to be doing it with drastically devalued currency. So it's not going to, you're not going to get what you thought you were going to get because the currency will be worth a lot less. And thinking that you're going to be able to live off of it is probably a pipe dream. So you need to make alternate plans. And you also have to realize that when you do work for the government, you're dependent upon that government being solvent in order to keep your job. I would say in particular, if you work for a state or local government, you need to be careful because I think we're going to see a lot of state and local governments in really, really dire financial straits in the next year or two. One of the reasons why is because the bond market and a lot of their bonds, basically their bond rating is going to nothing, and they're basically going to run out of their ability to raise funding. And you have to realize too, a lot of the tax revenue that they're getting is coming from an economy that's in decline, right? So they're going to be getting less and less in taxes. How are they going to be able to afford to pay? So you're going to see, I think, a lot of downsizing in local and state governments out of necessity. So before you get downsized, downsize yourself. Be looking for alternative employment if you can. And of course, reduce your dependence on the modern economy, particularly for the essentials of life, but also, as I talked about, for entertainment and for informing your priorities. The modern popular culture is going to tell you that you need to keep up with the Joneses and you need to know all the celebrities' doings and you need to know all the sports scores and all other stuff. None of that stuff has any positive influence on your life. And when it comes to any kind of hard times, it's going to have even less importance. So maybe negative importance, right? You don't want those things to inform your priorities. And if you can get disconnected, not just from government employment, but even from like a corporate employment, if you can, that would also, particularly if you're the company that you're working for is going to be facing some tough times ahead, you be proactive in finding other employment for sure. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, Jason, you mentioned 2 slides ago about community, and I want to mention I got into a fascinating conversation last night that ended up going until 3 a.m. this morning, and
wow,
because we're talking about all this stuff, and one of the visions I've had recently that has come very clear to me, and I was sharing this last night in our conversation, was I think one of the biggest solutions we are going to find in this transitional phase is small communities popping up, thousands of them all over the country with maybe a few hundred or a few thousand people. So really localizing our community and our governance of that community and our systems of that community and the interdependence of that community. I think community is the biggest, one of the, localized community is one of the biggest solutions for reducing our dependency and for, again, solving these issues. Because right now we have, one government trying to run 350 million people's lives, as well as many other countries around the world that they're trying to run and manage as well.
Exactly.
And it's simply way too massive. You've heard, the bigger you are, the bigger you fall. Well, it's absolutely true in this country. I mean, when the government fails, which I think it's going to have to because the systems are falling apart, it will be a huge crash. But if we're building, rather than waiting for that to happen, what I'm focused on is building these small, localized, interdependent communities. And if you do that, get involved in a community, an intentional community, an eco-village, a farming community, whatever it is, but either start one, find one, get involved in one near you. you're automatically going to start solving a lot of these issues, right? You're going to solve your dependency issues. You're going to solve your food issues. You're going to solve your basic need issues. You're going to solve the pollution issues because you're not trucking and shipping and transporting goods and foods and drinks and liquids and clothing across the country and across the world. I mean, it solves so many things, but I just can't emphasize enough how clear that's become to me now. You know, the solution in this country is not a big government for everybody. It's small localized governance with small communities, thousands of them or even tens of thousands of them all over the country.
I couldn't agree more, Nathan. In fact, this goes back to a discussion I had briefly on Facebook the other day with somebody who was talking about that going back to this issue of, you know, where you shape the future with how you spend your money. And you know, when I have a conversation with somebody, and we talk about some of these issues, they go, well, what can we do, right? I mean, how can we? The government seems like it's just out of control. What can we do? And what I say is starve the beast, right? You got this like you said, just this unbelievably massive government, and really, I mean, the United States of America has become the largest global empire in the history of the world, bar none. It is so far beyond us sustainable. It's not even funny. The best thing we can do is opt out and starve the beast as much as we can. And I mean, honestly, I'm not saying that you should not pay your taxes, but frankly, I think what we need in America would be helpful in a lot of ways is a widespread, massive tax revolt, because the government keeps doing what's doing because everybody stays in line and keeps feeding it and funding it, right?
Right, right.
So but yeah, totally in agreement with you. Relocalization is the key, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. So let me come back to that in a moment. But one thing that relates to this too is, you know, how do we even engage in this conversation with people of relocalizing in community, because people are so far from it now. This is a great segue into this next point, which is we need to unplug from the modern culture. And what I mean by the modern culture is the modern consumerist entertainment culture that drives us or asks of us to give it our full attention. And this could be everything from TV to sports to movies to music to Facebook to whatever. And I kind of see Facebook as a tool that you can use for good or ill, again, like I said earlier. But the point is that there's all these things demanding our attention. And unless we make a conscious decision to say no and unplug from those things, we're not going to be able to refocus on local community, because we're not going to have the time or attention to engage with our neighbors, or even potentially to move to another place where we have that kind of a setup like you're talking about with these smaller intentional communities. So what we need to do is return to the old paths of faith, family, and community, right? We need to return to those essentials that, you know, if the world fell apart tomorrow, what are going to be the most important things? Faith, family, and community. Because that's, no man's an island. You can't be Lone Ranger and survive. Even if you survive physically, eventually you're going to probably die from loneliness, right? Because man was made to be a relational being. And so we need to recognize that. And we also have to recognize that that's one of the reasons we need to unplug this modern culture, because the modern culture is largely anti-relational. As relational as Facebook seems, it's lacking so much in the lack of interpersonal, you know, in person, face to face type of interactions. So some of the other things you can do: stop watching TV. You don't need it. If you're watching TV, don't need it. I honestly have not watched TV in at least a dozen years, and I haven't missed it at all. So I'm not saying that I haven't watched TV like once or twice, you know, here or there. What I'm saying is, like, I don't watch TV at home at all. I just don't. We have a TV that we use for watching films and stuff, but we don't watch TV. And I have no loss. Anything that I would need to get from TV back in the day, like news, I can get on the internet now. So I don't even need to plug into that mass marketing, mass mind control channel that I was talking about earlier. Don't waste your time on sports. Like I said earlier, it doesn't affect your life in a positive way. It's largely distraction and a wasting of your time and effort. So this is particularly one for men. Use the time and energy that you have for productive things. in leading your family and your community and building a better future, not on watching other men play games. Use media and internet wisely as a learning and research tool. And I say this specifically because it's a great tool for learning and research, but it can also be another tool of modern culture, and that you can get sucked into and waste time, just like you're wasting time on TV or sports or something. I mean, you can sit for hours and scroll through Facebook or watch other stuff. Don't get caught into that trap. It requires discipline. So be conscious and disciplined about how you use your time online. And then getting back to your point, Nathan, get out and engage your local community. Establish relationships, do activities together, things like community gardens and local food events and all these kind of things are really important because they help build connections in the fabric of the local economy and the local community that are essential to being able to build the future that we want and not rely upon what we have and what we have handed to us. One thing I want to mention relating to this point, it wasn't in the film. I wish we had it on film in the interview we did with Franklin Sanders, but he did a webinar with me a couple years ago, and the topic was how to rebuild our local economies. And he said a very profound thing in that that training session we did. And what he said was, "Don't wait. Build the new economy now." And what he meant by that was, regardless of whether you're you're a prepper and you think that there's going to be some cataclysmic event, economic collapse or EMP or whatever it is, whether it's that or whether it's what I think is more likely, which is more of this trend that we have, which is this long, slow slide into the abyss, and at some point we have a crisis. In either case, no matter what the case is, the best case scenario that we can contribute to is building a new economy now that will be in operation when there is some crisis, or if it's this long, slow slide of declining economic activity and unemployment and all these other things, at some point, people are going to be so disenfranchised with the modern system, they're going to look around, they're going to go, hey, look at Nathan, look at Jason, look at all these other people that are vibrant and thriving. They're doing something different. What is it, right? And so viable economic models are going to present themselves in contrast to non-viable, unsustainable economic models, which is what we have in the modern economy. And so we need to be intentionally building the new economy now. And that starts in our local communities. We have to do it local community by local community, so that regardless of what scenario unfolds in the future, we are building the foundation for something to replace it that will provide hope for the future, rather than just having to deal with a crisis that's foisted upon us. Wrapping up here, it's important to get your priorities straight. And I always tell people, what are the most important things? Fulfill your duty to God, family, and community. And I use the term duty on purpose because if you look at all of the great Americans that have gone before us, probably without a one, all of them had a sense of duty to the calling that they had to do whatever it was that they did that had a big impact for their families, their communities, their nations. It is duty rather than a sense of entitlement or a sense of what's in it for me that is what fuels greatness. And so if we can start to think in terms of duty rather than what do I feel like doing or what do I want to do, we're more likely to make wise decisions that are going to have a positive impact for the future than if we're thinking in the terms of our day, which is what's in it for me. It's important to live within your means, obviously. So this means getting out of debt, but also it means thinking sustainably in terms of, not just debt, but having a margin. So you may not be in debt, you might be able to pay all your bills, but having contingency plans, having savings that you're building up, having your assets and things that have lasting value rather than the devalued currency. These are all important things that fall under this rubric of living within our means. It's also very important to learn as well as teach important skills to your family. So those who are under your care, you want to not just look at the skills for you, but also for your immediate team, your family unit, those who are you're closest with, and work together to develop your capability, your skill set to be able to do various things that are important to provide for you that, either in the near term or in the future are going to become critical for not just surviving but thriving in the face of crisis that is undoubtedly coming in some form or another. It's important to be a good steward of your wealth and your skills, and this is having a mindset that it's not all about you, and it's not all your stuff, right? It's been given to you, and you need to be a good steward of that, and handle it lightly. If you personalize everything and think of everything in terms of mine, if you do have a loss, it's going to be much harder to get through. If you see it as I'm being a steward of this wealth and what God's given me, and holding it lightly, it's going to be much easier to get through any potential crisis or loss than it would be if you're personifying and making it part of your being. And then also determine how to be a productive household. And this can be as simple as growing a garden. And another thing I'd highly recommend on top of growing a garden is starting a family business, even if it's something small. This relates to getting out of the employment trap, right? Because the modern economy, again, is that wages and goods economy. You have to have wages coming in to pay for the essentials of life. So one of the critical things you need to do is not just being a productive household in terms of growing more of your own food and reducing your need and the amount that you consume, but to the extent that you can get out of that employment trap where you're dependent upon the government or a corporate entity for your job, you're going to have more freedom of movement going forward. Because the modern economy in its the form that it's in is largely crumbling in a lot of ways, it's important to take action, like I said, to build a new economy now. Growing a garden is one way to do that, starting a local business. If you can and you have the ability to do it, farming is a good one to do because everybody's got to eat. And as the centralized economy starts kind of unraveling, the local food economy is going to be growing to fill that gap. And it's important that we're contributing to that either as a producer or as a local consumer. If you can't get a completely new job or start your own business, look at getting a side job that you can gain skills and experience in. So this would be maybe a part-time job, or heck, even if it's not something that is for income, if you can get something you can use to gain skills and experience, that is phenomenal, because it'll give you more options in the future, potentially to change the employment situation, maybe start a business or something like that. If you have skills that allow you to do freelance work, like online work and that kind of stuff, that would be great. A lot of businesses need services that freelancers can provide, whether it's graphic design, web design, copywriting, sales work. A lot of that stuff you can do kind of on the side, keep your current job, gain another source of income, and be able to fulfill a need of a local business. And that's really, what is a great entrepreneur? A great entrepreneur looks for the needs of businesses and consumers and serves them well. And in this case, being having a side job or a freelance type of arrangement, if you just look out there at what businesses need, you'll find that they have a lot of needs. And particularly because with the current economic environment, it's really hard for them to hire new employees because they have all these taxes and costs, Obamacare and all these other things that they have to do that are prohibitive, but they still have this work that needs to get done. So in many cases, hiring a outsourced employee or a contract employee, not really an employee, but a contract worker to do certain things is much more appealing to them and fits their needs much better than hiring a full-time employee. And so use that to your advantage and look for those opportunities to do that. All right, wrapping up here, connecting to community like we were talking about earlier. How do you do this, right? If you haven't started this process, what do you do? It's important to find like-minded citizens who love liberty. Now, what do I mean by that? If you want to reduce your dependence on the modern system, you have to value liberty, and the only way that you're going to find other people to go travel that journey with you are those who love liberty. Okay, if people love their dependence, there's no point in trying to change their mind to come with you on a journey of liberty away from dependence. Okay, so find others who love liberty. It's important to try to find organizations and groups of people that share and educate And some examples of these are like garden clubs, right? They share information, they share seeds, they do seed exchanges and these kind of things, and you can build great relationships with like-minded people who like to grow their own food, like to grow plants, and experience the beauty of nature together. That's a great type of organization to be a part of. Constitution groups or like-minded political groups. I put constitution groups in here because generally speaking, the people who love liberty and emphasize liberty are the ones who look back to the founding of liberty in America with a constitution. So those tend to be ones where you can find like-minded people. Service organizations can also be a good place because if people have an other focus, it's not about what's in it for me, but they're there to serve. They're going to have the right perspective on life, and you're going to find people that you can work with. And community-supported agriculture is a great one. And there's a specific thing here that I want to recommend that you look for. If you can source some of your food that you need for your family from a local farmer, that's great. If you can do it through a community-supported agriculture or CSA program, that's even better. It's probably the best construct for supporting the farmer and giving them predictability and how to plan their production and predictability in terms of income. On top of that, there's a special opportunity that a lot of CSA farms will have where you can do what's called a work share, often referred to as a work share, which is basically you go to the farm, you contribute your labor to help on the farm, and in return, you get a portion or a share of the production. And so instead of having to pay for your food, you can basically work for your food. Now, the beauty of this is not just the fact that there's no dollar transactions, right? It's basically a barter exchange. Beyond that, if you want to learn how to grow food better, what better place to learn than from a farmer who's growing food, right? So you can get not only exchange labor for food, which is a necessity, but you can also gain essential skills that you're going to need to be able to produce more of your own food. And this is kind of like the win-win-win, right? The farmer's winning, and you're winning on two counts because you're getting food out of the deal and skills. And so that's a really, really good thing to look for if you can find it. And finally, local business organizations. Small businesses tend to be more aware of the realities of economics and business than most because they got to pay the bills, the tax bills, the employee bills, all that other kind of stuff. Most businesses, unless they're crony capitalists who like to get government to rig the rules in their favor and give them government payments and subsidies, largely speaking, small businesses tend to be more liberty-oriented and tend to be hardworking type of people. And so you'll find in small business owners a lot of that kind of like-mindedness for this type of effort. So wrapping up, this is my last one here. It's important to learn from history and be prepared, right? We have to understand how we got here to understand what we need to do to go forward and what we should be prepared for. We need to plan how to extricate ourselves from the grid. We can't just sit around waiting for the grid to replace itself with something better and more sustainable. We can't wait for it to suddenly start looking out for our interests. It's not going to, right? It's working in its own interests. The powers that be have set it up to work on behalf of them, not on behalf of the masses of people. So key ways you can do this: grow more of your own food and source locally what you can't grow yourself. Reduce your need. Live more simply. Produce what you need. And this could even be down to, producing not just more of your own food, but producing other things that you need. It could even be in terms of energy, getting a wood-burning stove and getting the fuel from your property. That's a way of producing what you need. And finally, giving priority to family and community is essential, because without that, we're not going to be able to build the strong, local, decentralized alternatives that are going to be the hope for the future when the centralized system that we are currently seeing the initial parts of the unraveling, when it really starts to unravel, we're going to need to have a strong family and strong community to be able to do that. So that's the end of my presentation for now. Nathan, do you have any comments or questions you wanted to ask?
I think you covered a lot, Jason, and I'm glad. This has been our longest presentation, but we went over the time that we had allotted for this. But no, not at all. I mean, I was really happy to allow us to go into this much depth, because you covered so much important and relevant information, and I love how you really showed a lot of the action steps people can take. You know, the three things that come to mind are local, homemade, and organic, in that order. You know, so or handmade, I should say, instead of homemade, kind of the same thing in my mind. And, you know, to kind of recap on that, what that means is, first, whatever you can, you know, look at all three. If you're buying something, if you're getting something, if you're, you know, whatever it is, try to find something, all three: local, handmade, organic. If you can't, you know, start with local. If you can't find what you need local, at least get it handmade. If you can't find what you need handmade, at the very least, get it organic, right? Especially when we're talking about food, but even clothing. I mean, because the clothing, the blankets, the things you're putting, you know, again, it's all about where our dollar is. So ideally, it's those three things: local, handmade, and organic. And to encompass that, as much of it yourself, your family, or your neighbors you can do, let's do it. I mean, I know that we're in a really interesting time as a society, but we have some big opportunities. We have some big opportunities to make some good changes for the future of our families and for the future of our communities. As you know, old systems are collapsing, it's always an opportunity to build new systems that are coming from that space of care. And I do want to mention that. I mean, I do appreciate how you mention, you know, God and faith. You know, we call it spirituality, spirit, source, oneness, divinity, whatever you want to call it. But having that in our intention, in our hearts, in the work that we do, you know, that selflessness, that service to others, that service to humanity, that is going to drive our actions and our intentions and the results to a much better outcome than this other, you know, what's in it for me? I want to acquire as much as I can. It's all about greed. It's all about control. We know what that game is like, and it's not working. So to get beyond that, we have to change our intent and the way that we show up in life. And to me, that's also having that deep spiritual reverence for our Creator, for our humanity, and for our planet. And so, yeah, I just want to thank you for sharing as much as you did. And I do want to share with folks how people can get in touch with you and how they can support the projects you're doing, and find out more about your film and all of that. So maybe just take a minute and talk about that.
Yeah, well, you mentioned about the film, and I think I mentioned real briefly earlier that we're releasing it this summer. We are finishing up the post-production phase, and are going to be releasing it to our supporters here very shortly, and then shortly thereafter, this summer, it'll be out online, and we'll be doing film screenings around the country as we're able to. If you are interested in being a supporter, we do have a supporter. You can still contribute. We still need additional funding to help finish the film and really do the release and the launch. It's pretty expensive. Just, I mean, most Hollywood films spend way more on marketing than they do on the actual production. So we can use all that we can get. But our supporter awards, we've tried to make very actionable. So we have books and resources, as well as a member site with uncut footage of all of our videos and the interviews and site visits we've done. And we've also have a whole bunch of webinar recordings that we've done over the past couple of years. Kind of actionable self-reliance topics and preparedness topics, things that you can help you get more prepared for what's ahead and be more self-reliant, reduce your dependence on these systems. We made an intentional decision to do that because one, we can't cover everything in a 90-minute film. A lot of it is going to be the why and the what. And the how is largely going to be a lot of detailed stuff that we're covering through these online trainings and stuff. So we're trying to equip people to actually make the lifestyle changes necessary. So if you're interested in doing that, you can go to beyondoffgrid.com and click the support link and look at that. We also, as Nathan and I were talking before we started the presentation, last year produced a Beyond Off Grid Summit event, which was both online training as well as a 3-day training conference. And back in November, some of you may have seen this, we did a week-long training event called Beyond Off-Grid Summit with our online training. That's available as an online course. If anybody's interested, you can go to our website and learn more about that. And we also did this hands-on training event at this special permaculture farm in the mountains of Virginia. And we talked about a whole bunch of different topics, things like homestead planning, how to build soil, low-tech growing systems, how to do homestead building. I actually worked on a barn while we were there. Woodlot management, even had a horse logger there to do horse logging demos for us, and raising animals, since that's an important part of sustainable food production. a whole bunch of other things. We captured all of that on video, and we're in the process of post-production now of producing that as a video course. So if you're interested in getting more demonstration and kind of hands-on instruction in video format, you can check that out. We'll probably be releasing that in a couple months later this summer as well. So all told, we've been really focusing on inspiring and equipping people to make the lifestyle change, to return to the old paths and be, away from this dependent kind of lifestyle and these centralized systems and toward a more self-reliant, decentralized, locally focused and locally interdependent lifestyle. And that's what we're really been focusing on. So the film is coming soon, and as well as some of these other training resources available. We'd love to have you join us. And we also are continuing to do online training as well. So if you want to join free online training, we do webinars generally a couple times a month, and you can get on our email list to get notified of when those are coming up. So Nathan, thanks so much for your time and letting me go long on the presentation, but I'm glad that we were able to find a lot of, I can tell that you've got the same mindset I do in terms of the importance of decentralizing, localizing as the solution to the ailments that we have in modern society. And I'm glad to see all the work you're doing to help make that a reality in your part of the world, your part of the country, and even around the world as you're doing this summit and other things that you're working on. So thanks a lot for your work.
Awesome, absolutely, yeah, and thank you. And we'll put a link to Jason's website below the video. Check that out, beyondoffgrid.com. Click that and you can look into all the things that Jason just mentioned. Also, if you missed any of the presentations during the Self-Reliance Summit, when they were free, now they've been, if they're not available anymore during the free period, you can own them. There's an upgrade option. Should be an upgrade button on this page. Click that and take a look at that. We've made it very reasonable, and we're one of the small family-based home. We run our small family company out of our home, and it's when you upgrade, it helps support us to be able to do these kinds of events and to do the work that we do. We also donate quite a bit to nonprofits that are doing this kind of work as well. So even though you upgrade to own, so you can have all these presentations and watch them and listen to them as many times as you want, just know you're also supporting everything we're just talking about here with locality and small family-based businesses and putting back into the environment and self-reliance. Anyway, so we appreciate that. You can take a look at the upgrade link. Other than that, Jason, thank you so much. This has been an incredibly valuable presentation, and just want to thank everybody for tuning in. We appreciate you for being here, for sharing this with your friends and family, and for giving us your feedback during the summit. We love to bring this information to you, and we appreciate you for being a part of our community. So other than that, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you in the next interview. Take care.